What? 5 seconds.
5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our final class in this series about blessings. Today the focus will be a little bit more on the practical, learning the blessings, actually learning what blessings to make on different kinds of foods. So this will be more of a workshop. But before I speak, I'd like to say a few words. You know how rabbis are. Before they speak, they like to say a few words. Tonight, tomorrow, the day after, are auspicious days in relation to blessings. The previous Lubavitcher Rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, was arrested for the final time. He was arrested many times by the Tsarist government and then later by the communist government. And his crime was teaching Torah and establishing schools for children all over the Soviet Union. There were about 600 underground schools for children. Most people in the Soviet Union didn't know about their existence, but Jews who were interested in educating their children at the risk of losing their freedom and even their lives sent their kids to these underground schools. My father-in-law was involved in teaching and spreading Judaism in the Soviet Union, and the miracle was that he was not arrested. And the miracle was because of a biological factor. All the Hasidim, who were the main teachers of Torah, had beards. They grew beards consistent with Hasidic tradition and with Jewish law and so on and so forth. But my father-in-law's beard didn't grow until he was in his 30s. So no one suspected him of being a pious Jew. But actually, he was once summoned to the KGB at that time. They had a different name, Gepa'u, I think they were called, or Enkivider. They changed their initials every few years. The initials changed, but they didn't change. And they summoned him. It was the night of Sukkot, the holiday of Sukkot. And they made you wait for hours and hours just to wear you down. And he's sitting there and he says, you know what? It's the holiday of Sukkot. A Jew has to eat in a sukkah. So what did he do? He climbed out of a window. If they would have caught him, they would have shot him. And he went to where he found the sukkah. He ate something, and he came back, and they didn't miss him. And when someone asked him, do you realize what you did? You just endangered your life. He says, what do you mean? I'm a Jew. I have to sit in a sukkah, so I go to a sukkah. This is the kind of people that were involved as emissaries, as agents of the previous Rebbe, who, before leaving the Soviet Union, after his sentence was commuted, he made a covenant with his Hasidim. He called in 9 prominent Hasidim, and he said, you are to continue to spread Judaism and keep Judaism alive to the last drop of blood. And many of them did not survive. And others that did survive, I knew who they were. They came to America later on. At any rate, the previous Rebbe was arrested for the final time by the communist regime. The people who came to arrest him were Jews. One of them was a descendant of Hasidim. His name was Lulav, and the other one was Nachmanson. And they were ardent communists, atheists, communists, anti-Semites, Jew haters. And they were the ones who arrested him, and they were preparing to have him shot that night. And it's a whole long story, which I'm not going to go into. He made a wrong turn, and he went to the wrong place. And that allowed, I guess, some more efforts to be launched to try to save him. And at the end, he was sentenced to death, and the death sentence was commuted to 10 years of slave labor, and that was commuted to 3 years of exile. And he was sent to a city called Kostroma. And before he went, one of his Hasidim, he summoned him, when you get there, make sure there's a school for children, a Jewish school for children, and fix the mikveh there. The mikveh needed repair. In other words, he was sentenced because of his counter-revolutionary activity in keeping Judaism alive. And what is the first thing he does there? Continues to do it. And then they finally not only freed him from exile on the 12th day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, they actually allowed him to leave the country. And he said, I'm not leaving unless I can take with me all of my library. Now, how many books does an average rabbi have in his library? You know, in Russia especially, a few hundred. We're not talking about the affluent America. He had 30,000 books in his library. And he says, I'm not leaving until every single book is taken out. And some of the books were really very precious books, worth probably by now millions of dollars, because they were the first century of the printing press. And they let everything out because he threatened that he's not going to leave. So he actually was the first person to fight Stalin and win. And the Rebbe maintained that the collapse of the Soviet Union started with his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, giving them a blow which weakened their whole power. And eventually, when you weaken the power of something, eventually it just collapses, which it did, yes.
What happened to that library?
The library is now housed in 770 Eastern Parkway, but it expanded. It was combined with the Rebbe's library, and together it's one of the largest Jewish libraries in the world. It has about between 200,000 and 300,000 volumes of Jewish texts. So that library is extant. There's another part of the library that is now in Moscow, and Putin will not let it leave Moscow, claiming that it's a treasure, a national treasure. He won't let it leave. So that's maybe why Putin is having problems. Yes?
I thought talk about exactly about this library, what now in Moscow.
Right, that's a smaller part of the library. It's the library of the previous Rebbe's father. That was, I don't know all the details, but the government, I guess, protected it from being pillaged by the Germans, and they refused to let it go. At any rate, so what does it have to do with blessings? When he got to his destination in Kostroma, he delivered a discourse on the mitzvah, on the commandment to bless God when you get out of danger. There are 4 kinds of situations that the Talmud discusses, and they're actually rooted in the book of Psalms, that when a person goes on a trip and they're traveling through the desert, in those days traveling through the desert was extremely dangerous, and you arrived at your destination, you have to thank God for that. If you traveled by sea and you got to your destination, you had to thank God. If you were arrested and you were liberated, you have to thank God. If you were very ill and you recovered from it, you have to thank God. Those are the 4 examples given by the Talmud. And there's a special blessing that we say. We're not going to go into that blessing right now, but that's a blessing that you say in which you thank God for bestowing kindness on you by surviving all these 4 different ordeals. So he delivered a discourse on that blessing, always showing gratitude to God for the miracles that he experienced. So I thought it was an auspicious time to talk about blessings, because this is a day of blessing. The 12th day, that's tonight, 12th day of Tammuz, and the 13th. Why do we celebrate 2 days? Because he was actually told on the 12th day of Tammuz that the office was not fully functioning, the government office, because it was a Russian holiday, that he should come back the next day to get the official papers that would free him. Just to share one incident, when the prison officials would come to you to give you some type of information, announcement, you would have to stand up. So they came to him when they were telling him that his sentence was commuted, that he was going to be freed. They came to his cell. Among them was this Lulav character, this Jewish communist who was later on killed by Stalin, by the way. They were all wiped out because they were Jewish. Even though they were the most ardent communists, they were more ruthless than their non-Jewish counterparts. So this Mr. Lulav comes in there and tells them to stand up in Russian, and he says, and the Rebbe only answered in Yiddish. That was his way of showing defiance. Even though he understood Russian and he spoke Russian, but he responded in Yiddish, and he's saying, no, I'm not going to stand up. So they said, well, if you don't stand up, we'll beat you. So he said, so, and they beat him, and they left. Then they came a second time, different people, and again a Jewish person was with them, telling him in Russian that he should stand up, and he said, he just didn't answer, and they said, we'll beat you, and they beat him again, and he suffered from the beating for years to come. He suffered from it, the injury that they caused. And they went a third time, and it still didn't help. They beat him again. And so they had no choice. And it's interesting that the Lulav, this vicious anti-Semitic Jew, when he addressed the Rebbe, he called him Rebbe. In other words, while he's torturing him, he showed him that he recognizes that he is the Rebbe, that he is the rabbi. So what happened is they told him that his sentence was going to be commuted to exile. And what happened? They told him that it was Thursday now, and that he was going to be sent by train to Kostroma. I don't know exactly what Kostroma is, but it's not so close to Moscow. Leningrad. It wasn't Moscow. It was Leningrad at that time. So he asked them, when does the train arrive? So they said, on Saturday. He says, I'm not going. Now, Jewish law allows you to get out of jail when you're in the Soviet Union and they let you out of jail. Not only are you allowed to travel on Shabbat, in this case, he wouldn't be traveling, he would be in the train. There was no question that he was allowed to travel, but he wanted to make a point because they wanted to make a point. What do you think they wanted? Why they wanted him to travel on Shabbos? So they can tell all the Jews in the Soviet Union, you're a great leader, the defiant leader violated the Shabbos. So he's not so holy as you think, and you don't have to keep Shabbos anymore. He understood what their ruse was, and he refused. They said, well, you'll have to stay in prison until Sunday to get the train after Shabbos. He said, so be it. And they threatened that he might never get out of prison. And when you're in a Soviet prison, that means you're also vulnerable because they can then decide to reinstate the death penalty. You're talking about Stalin. Stalin was not afraid of anyone. So this is considered a great miracle that he survived the ordeal and he triumphed over the forces of evil. There was pressure from the American government. There was a senator of Idaho. His name was, I just slipped my mind. Anyhow, a senator from Idaho who was the main person who was fighting to get the Rebbe out. So someone asked him, you don't have any Jewish constituents in your state. How many Jews lived in Idaho in the 1920s? I doubt if you can count them on one hand. He says, why are you doing this? He said, I'm doing it for another constituency. Burra, Senator Burra. Burra was his name. I don't know how he spelled it, B-O-R-O. You could try to look it up. He was the senator of Idaho in 1927. So this is a time when we show gratitude to God, because if the Rebbe had not survived, we wouldn't be here today. That's for sure. Because when he got out of Russia, what did he do? What do you think the Rebbe did? He was tortured. He suffered from many different illnesses. He moved to Poland, to Latvia, then Poland, and he established a network of schools all over Poland. Different kind of competition, not competing with the Soviets, competing with other parts of the Jewish community. And then when the war broke out, and he was saved from the Nazis in 1939, he was in Warsaw, the Warsaw area when the war broke out. He fled to the United States, And when he came to the United States, he was paralyzed. He was in a wheelchair. He suffered from MS, among other things. He had stroke and a heart attack. And when he came to America, he established a network of day schools all over the Northeast. And when the Rabbi, his son-in-law, came, he expanded his activities, writing thousands of letters to people. That's the one thing that he wasn't limited to. He was able to write, and he wrote thousands of letters. If we look at his output, he probably wrote in his course of life 100,000 letters, letters to Jews of all backgrounds, of all different stripes. And besides the letters, he wrote about 40 volumes of Torah commentary, plus we don't even know how much, a voluminous diary. From the age of 11 till the time he passed away, he would write a diary of all his experiences. And some of it had been published, but most of it is still in manuscript. So we're talking about, when did he have time to do all this? The only one who was able to surpass him was his son-in-law, the present Rabbi. So with that introduction, let's go to the blessings. We already covered the blessing Hamodsi, but I want to just make a brief introduction. So before I say a few words, I'd like to say a few more words of introduction. The whole idea of saying a blessing before eating is very simple. It's a way of showing appreciation to God for giving us the ability to live and by eating food. The world without food, people without food could not survive. So we're grateful. Not to bless God is a sign of a lack of gratitude. But it's not enough just to thank God for food in general. We also have different blessings for different categories of food. Why is that? Because, as I mentioned, and I think in the first class, or one of the first classes, gratitude exists on two planes. There's a general idea that I'm grateful for everything, which is positive and the way it should be. I'm grateful for all my blessings, for everything that I have that is positive in my life. There are two kinds of people. There are people who are always grumpy, who are always complaining. It's too hot outside. It's too cold outside. Especially if you live in Buffalo. And we complain about it. Why are you complaining? Why are we complaining? I include myself in the category. Why are we complaining? After all, this is God's world. You can complain about when people do some things that are bad, but God doesn't do anything bad. He does things sometimes that we don't appreciate, we don't understand, but we thank God for everything. If it's raining, we say thank God for the rain. Without the rain, we couldn't have any crops growing. If it snows, well, if you like skiing, it gives you an opportunity to ski. But whatever natural phenomena there are, we're grateful to God. We shouldn't be grumpy and complaining. You're a happier person, a person who's always grateful, who just wakes up in the morning and says, thank you, God, that I'm alive. We have the special words of Modani. That's a much different kind of a person who will always be happy and always feel fulfilled. So that's the general idea of let's be grateful people. Let's be grateful for everything that we have. But then there's a deeper kind of gratitude. A kind of gratitude where we appreciate each nuance, every aspect of our life. We see how different it is from everything else. We savor everything. God could have created a very bland world where everything is the same. All foods are exactly the same. In other words, we would just be eating, like the astronauts, some type of concentrated food with all the minerals and vitamins and nutrients, but all the food is the same. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, weekdays, Shabbos, you eat the same thing. You know what? It already happened once. If you remember, who's old enough to remember, 3,300 years ago, in the desert, we had manna from heaven. So you think, what could be better than manna from heaven? It says that whatever taste you had in mind, if you wanted to taste a sizzling steak, it tasted like a sizzling steak. If you wanted it to taste like strawberry ice cream, it tasted like strawberry ice cream. Whatever taste you had in mind, that's the taste you had. And people complained about the manna. It was heavenly food, most nutritious food ever, but people hated it. We just read about it. They complained about it. Why were they complaining? It's the same food every day. True, the tastes were different, but when you look at the food and it looks like a piece of tofu, and that's all, who cares about the taste? Your eyes are part of what makes you appreciate the food. That's why chefs are trained to prepare food in a way that it's appetizing to the eye, not just to the palate, because that's part of what it means to be a human being. We use all of our senses in everything that we do. And the more we use all of our senses in good things, the deeper the connection is to that thing. That's why it's interesting, at the end of Shabbat, we make Havdalah. We say a special prayer. And we involve all of our senses. We drink the wine, let's taste. We smell the psamim, the spices, that smell. We look at the candle, look at our fingertips in the light of the candle, that's vision. We say the prayer, so that's the audio part of it. And we touch the wine. At the end of the Havdalah, there's a custom for people to put their pinkies in the wine, and they put it over their eyelids. So there's all five senses, which reinforces the whole idea of what Havdalah is. We're not going to go into what Havdalah is right now. When you involve more senses, I'll just say one more thing about this. When we went to school in my days, which century was that? 20th century, not 19th. Okay. So when we had a bifurcated educational experience. In the morning, we did Jewish studies. In the afternoon, we did secular studies in elementary school. So in the morning, when we would read the text of the Chumash, the five books of Moses, or the Mishnah, or the Talmud, and we were just caught reading it with our eyes, the teacher would tell us, say the words, vocalize them, make sure you're saying it, you can hear what you're saying. Okay. Then we went to the afternoon and we were reading, and someone would move their lips, and the teacher would, don't move your lips, just read with your eyes. So that's what caused all my emotional issues, this conflict between morning and afternoon. But you know what? Science has shown that when you say the words and you involve more than one sense, the sense of vision, but you also involve the sense of speech and the hearing, it has a much more profound effect on you, a more indelible effect on you. So you use all your senses, you are going to have a much more profound effect. So when you deal with food, it's important to enjoy the food, if you want to enjoy the food, to appreciate the food, to recognize that there are different categories of foods, and each one has a different function, a different contribution, and you're grateful for every individual bit of goodness, because sometimes a person can say, yeah, I'm grateful that I have food, but why should I show gratitude for this kind of food or that kind of food? No, that shows that your gratitude is deeper, that you appreciate everything that God does for us. Now, ideally, there would be a separate blessing for every type of food, but that would make it too cumbersome. So the sages who instituted the text of the blessings divided all blessings into 6 or 7 categories. We started off, we already did Hamodsi. Hamodsi is the first one on this sheet, where we thank God for producing the bread from the earth. Bread doesn't come out of the earth, as far as we know. But I explained in one of the earlier classes that it's a reference to the future in the Messianic age, that we won't have to produce wheat and then grind it, and that before you can grind it, you have to first separate the kernel from the chaff, and then you grind it, and then you mix the flour with water, and you roll it into a dough until then you bake it. The bread will come ready-made from the earth. So this is a reference, a hint to the future of the Messianic age. So what I would like everyone to do is to focus. All the blessings have the same introduction. Baruch atah, and then we say God's name. Elokeinu, Melech haolam. Blessed are you, our God, Lord our God, King of the universe. That's the standard introduction to every blessing. So that's easier to memorize. But then the end, the last 4 words, is something that people have to practice. Hamodsi lechem min haaretz. The one who brings forth bread from the earth. That's the most important type of food. It's clear from biblical sources and from the Talmud that the most important food is bread. Today, nutritionists may disagree and tell you it's not the most important kind of food, and every nutritionist has his own or her own theory about what is the best thing for you, which diet is the most healthy one, a Mediterranean diet, the Pritikin diet, and many other diets focus on different food groups. But the Talmud and the Torah makes it clear that bread is the most important food. It's the staff of life, as the expression goes. As it says in the Psalms, V'lechem levav enosh yisod, bread satiates the heart of humanity. The Talmud also says a child does not have the ability to recognize and say father or mother until it eats some grain. The child is nursed and it's all nutritious, but before the grain is consumed, the child doesn't have the ability to develop mentally to the point where they can recognize and refer to their parents as father and mother. So bread is considered the most important meal, and is a very important law. When you eat bread in a meal, you don't have to recite any other blessing for any of the other foods other than dessert, because bread is the centerpiece of the meal, and all the other foods are there to supplement the bread. You eat bread with something else, with vegetables, with meat, with whatever else you eat. Dessert is considered to be something that you eat after you finish the meal. You're no longer in need of nutrition. You already are satisfied, but you want to have a little bit of pleasure, so you eat dessert at the end. So when you make hamodsi on bread, that's the only blessing you have to make except for dessert, and one other exception. If you drink wine in the middle of the meal, you have to make a blessing on the wine, because the wine is considered to be something, not just an extension of the meal, it's an addition, it's a significant addition that stands on its own 2 feet. So that's the law of Hamodsi. Now, how do you determine that something is bread? Bread is a generic word. Lechem is a generic word. How do you determine? Any 5 grains, wheat, barley, oat, rye, and spelt. Those 5 grains, if they're mixed with water, and whatever else you put in it, it's mixed with water, it becomes bread. So you can make it into this kind of bread, that French bread, Italian bread, challah bread. They're all included in Hamodsi. In addition to the blessing of Hamodsi, when you eat bread, you also have to wash your hands in a specific way. We pour water over both of our hands with a special blessing, but we're not going to go into that right now. Just the Hamodsi is the focus. Yes?
What happens, not in a meal, but 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I feel like having a spoon of ice cream. You supposed to say a blessing?
If it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon?
Yeah, 3,
What about-
I just go to the refrigerator and take a spoon of ice cream. Do you say anything?
Yes. There's a
Yeah,
blessing.
I'm saying that it's good.
There's a blessing for ice cream also. Not a separate blessing, but we'll get to that's the shahakol blessing. That's the generic blessing. We'll get to that soon. Now, not all grain is turned into bread, which is the centerpiece of a meal that is eaten and to satisfy you. If you eat some tuna fish and you don't have bread with it, it's not going to be fulfilling. It won't satiate you. So bread is the food that satiates, and it stands in on its own 2 feet. But then there are people who will eat grain like cake, like cookies, pasta, oatmeal, cereal. These are considered to be one level above all other things that grow from the ground because they have grain in it, and grain isn't satisfying. But because they're not really what people make a meal out of, people don't make a meal out of pasta, although people do sometimes nowadays do a lot of things that are different from the way it used to be. So people usually don't eat that much of it, and it's not as satisfying. So there's a special blessing for cake and other things that are made out of those 5 grains. Remember, wheat, barley, oat, rye, and spelt. And that blessing is the second one on this list, Bore Mine Mizonos. Or if you use the Sephardic pronunciation, Bore Mine Mizonot. But either way is fine. What does that mean? You're thanking God who creates various kinds of sustenance. The key word here is sustenance. These foods, because they have grain, they do sustain you. If you're starving and you eat a piece of cake, it'll sustain you. It'll give you some strength that you wouldn't have from other foods. And because it's grain, it is more significant than just any other fruit or vegetable. They all come from the ground. But it's not what you make your meal out of, so you have a separate blessing. Let's say you're eating a piece of pizza. Pizza is, on one hand, it's like bread. Bread with some other stuff on it. So there's actually a difference. If the pizza is made with water, flour and water, then it is hamodsi. Then it's just like bread. If it's made with flour and fruit juices, then it's more like cake. It has this, then you make the other bracha, the Bore Mine Mizonos. But if you make a whole meal out of it, you eat, I don't know how, but let's say 2 big slices of pizza, it's just like bread no matter how it's made, because it becomes really, it serves the same function as bread. Then there's another blessing which we say when we drink wine. The only beverage that has its own blessing. Wine is very important. In Judaism, there are some religions that shun any type of alcohol. Maimonides was asked by the Sultan of Egypt, Saladin's son, who succeeded Saladin, to write him a manual for good health. He said, he wasn't a healthy person. These monarchs were not very healthy. They didn't lead healthful lifestyles. So we asked Maimonides, write a treatise for me, what I should do to stay healthy. So Maimonides writes there, I can tell you something, but I really can't tell you something that's good for your health, because you're not going to be able to follow it. But I'll tell you anyhow, drink wine every day. And you know what? The Sultan, even though he was a Muslim and he wasn't allowed to drink wine, I can assure you he did drink wine. You go to Dubai, they do have alcohol there. So they're not as conscientious as they may claim to be. At any rate, wine in Judaism was never looked upon as evil. Wine was looked upon with 2 eyes. 2 different ways of looking at wine. On one hand, wine is considered to be a source of joy. There's a biblical verse that calls wine, it brings gladness to God and people. In the temple, they would pour wine on the altar. We drink wine, we usher in the Shabbat by drinking wine. We usher in every major Jewish holiday, Rosh Hashanah, Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, with wine. On Passover, we drink 4 cups of wine at the Seder. Wine is a very important part of Jewish rituals and of Jewish celebratory occasions. On Purim, we're supposed to drink a lot of wine. So wine is not looked upon as evil if it's not abused. When it's abused, it's considered to be a source of great harm. Who abused wine? The first person to abuse wine. Does anyone know? Noah is not the first, no. According to one opinion, Adam and Eve, what was the fruit of the tree of knowledge? It was a grapevine. And they got drunk on the grapevine, on the wine. That was their downfall. If they had waited just a few more hours until the Shabbat, they would have been able to drink that wine and it would have been a happy occasion. So the first person to abuse wine was the first person. And Noah thought he's going to be able to do better than his ancestor, Adam, and he blew it as well. He got drunk as well. So we know that wine could be a source of terrible harm, and there are many other stories and throughout history how wine was destructive, but wine is also very positive. The Talmud says that there's an expression, nichnas yayin, yatsa sod, enter wine, out comes the secrets. And the word yayin, wine, by the way, the English word wine, where do you think it comes from? It comes from yayin. It's almost the same word. There's so many English words that are obvious, taken from biblical expressions. So anyhow, wine, if you add up the letters, every letter has a number value, it adds up to 70. The word for secret in Hebrew, sod, if you add up the numbers, it adds up to 70. So wine and secret are considered to be synonymous. What does that mean spiritually? That means that wine enables you to open up your personality, especially in times when you're supposed to be happy. And we have obstacles that don't let us be happy. So the Torah says, yes, use wine, and that will help you open up your soul. Is something wrong with it?
Yeah, maybe batteries.
Modern technology. You have a battery? Does that affect the...
No.
Okay, so we can do it without... You can hear me? Could you hear me? So wine allows you to express your inner spirituality because it's obstructed by so many other things that go on in our lives. Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron, brought an unauthorized offering and they died in the process. So according to one opinion, they entered the temple intoxicated. Why did they get intoxicated? They were not alcoholics. They got intoxicated because they wanted to express their spiritual feelings in ways that would not be obstructed. They went too far. So wine is it's a double-edged sword. It could be the greatest source of joy and of positive energy, and it will also be the greatest source of negativity. But because it's a special beverage, we thank God for the wine. That's Borei Pri Hagafen. Blessed is the creator of the fruit of the vine. Now it's interesting, if you eat grapes that are the real fruit of the vine, you don't say that blessing. Grapes are not considered to be significant enough to have its own blessing. Grapes are included in all fruits. But the wine, that's the real fruit of the vine. Vines were planted ideally and primarily for the wine, not for the fruit itself, not for the grape itself. But then when you eat fruit, you say the blessing, the end is Borei Pri Ha'etz, the creator of the fruit of the tree. Fruit is special, even though fruit is also like a vegetable. It grows from the ground, but it has its own distinction. People in the olden days, today we have all sorts of concoctions to serve as dessert, but in the olden days, dessert was fruit. You ate your meal, and at the end of the meal, you ate an apple, you ate a grape, or whatever fruit you ate. That was considered to be a condiment that you ate at the end of the meal. And even if you're eating bread, if you eat fruit at the end of the meal, you say the blessing, Borei Pri Ha'etz, because fruit has its own blessing. Then, if you eat vegetables, now what is a fruit and what is a vegetable? It's not what botanists, biologists consider fruits and vegetables. For example, they consider a tomato to be a fruit. But that's not how halacha defines fruit and vegetable. There's no conflict, it's just different criteria. For example, a banana is considered a vegetable in Jewish law because a banana tree is not like every other tree that after it produces a year's crop of bananas, it'll grow back next year. You have to plant it every year. It's not perennial. So bananas are considered to be vegetables. A pineapple is a vegetable, even though a cantaloupe, even though they're sweet and people would call them fruit, perhaps, no, they're vegetables because of the way they grow from the ground and not on branches of trees that are perennials. Yes?
So any fruit that would grow like in your garden, that would be a vegetable?
What kind of fruit? If you have an apple tree, that's a fruit.
Like a watermelon?
A watermelon is a vegetable in Jewish law that requires the blessing of a vegetable. Yes?
What about something like raspberries?
What about raspberries? Okay, the berries are very complicated. Blueberries, most authorities say, is considered a fruit. It depends how close to the ground they are. And raspberries, I think, is also considered a fruit. Strawberries are considered a vegetable. It all depends on how big the bushes are and how close to the ground they are.
Woody?
What?
If the branches are woodier.
That could.
I mean, blueberries and raspberries have woody branches.
Right, they're closer to being considered a tree. Yes.
So raspberries are a fruit?
Yeah. Tomatoes are considered vegetables. Cucumbers are vegetables, even though the biologists will call them fruits, but it has nothing to. It's not relevant to Jewish law. Then, when we eat a vegetable, the blessing is Borei Pri Ha'adama, the creator of the fruit of the earth, because it comes straight from the earth, doesn't grow on a tree, so it has its own blessing. Now, if by mistake you said the blessing Borei Pri Ha'adama on a fruit, it's covered. Why? Because a tree is also fruit of the earth. It goes through a tree, but it also comes from the earth ultimately. So if you said that blessing by mistake, it covers it. Then you have the generic blessing. Shahakol niya bidvaro. Everything became about by his word, whose word all things came to be, as they translate it here. And what does this include? All beverages, all liquids, except for wine. Meat, fish, eggs, mushrooms. What else is there that we didn't cover?
Quinoa.
Quinoa is a question. What?
Ice cream.
Ice cream is, right, included.
Peanut butter.
Peanut butter, yeah. If you eat plain peanut butter, because the peanut itself is considered like a vegetable. But when it's totally transformed, that you can't identify its origin, it loses its status. So if you have, let's say, potato chips. Potato chips are sliced potatoes, and they still resemble a sliced potato. But you have, what do they call them, Pringles?
Right.
Pringles are not potatoes. The potatoes are turned into mush, and then they're reconstructed. So Pringles would go into the generic category because it doesn't retain any resemblance to its origin. The laws of blessings become very, very complex. And entire books have been written to go through every little detail. In other words, we have an obsession with thanking God the right way. One rabbi once said, we don't thank God so we can eat the fruit or the food. We eat food so we can thank God. There's two ways of looking at it. That why do we eat? Because we have to show our gratitude to God. And it's another way of doing that. So we eat. We make a bracha. Yes?
If you make a mistake, because let's say you think a Pringle is a potato chip,
Okay.
sometimes it's hard to tell. Is it still okay that I use the prayer?
Okay, the question was asked, if let's say you make a mistake and you say the wrong blessing, Does lightning come down to zap you? And obviously, no, it's a mistake. But there are ways of correcting mistakes, depending on what the wrong blessing was. Let's say I said the generic blessing for something that has a specific blessing. It's covered. The generic covers everything. So if you don't know what the blessing is, and you have no way, you can't call the rabbi to find out, you can use the generic blessing. And we have a few laws over here that will answer some of the questions. A blessing is required whenever eating even a small amount of food. So you take your break to eat ice cream. Let's say you take a half a teaspoon, or just even a little morsel just to get the taste of it. You still say the blessing, because you did enjoy something from this world, and you say the blessing. And you should know what blessing you must make before you begin. You should find out what the blessing is. It takes a lot of concentration and effort. You can be a totally different person, because this is an exercise. It's like any type of physical exercise that makes you it conditions you. Well, this conditions us as well. Prior to saying the blessing, one should hold the food upon which the blessing is said, or the spoon or fork containing the food, in his right hand. We do everything, every mitzvah we do with our right hand, except if you're left-handed, then that becomes your right hand. So there's no such thing as left-handed people. Left-handed people have a different right hand. That's how Jewish law looks at it. So if you're left-handed, you hold it in your left hand. What's the idea? The stronger hand. When you want to do something positive, put the stronger effort into it. Don't do it with your weaker hand. That's a sign that you're really reluctant to do it. So you do it in your right hand, and you say the blessing. And here's something that a lot of people don't know. Do not talk until you swallow the first bite. It's not proper to thank God for something and then just forget about God. You focus on it until you finish the first bite. Now, as the name of God is mentioned in each blessing, and we do not say God's name in vain, this is something that I think our society has so badly messed up with. Everyone knows the 10 Commandments. The third commandment is not to bear God's name in vain. And when people use the word God together with another word, starts with a D, and ends with an N, and has an A and M in the middle, that is a violation of that commandment. That's a very serious violation. It's the most disrespectful thing you can do to invoke God's name other than in the context of prayer or in study of Torah, like I'm doing right now. But if I hear people say, I swear to, for some frivolous thing, that's a serious violation of the Torah. People should never swear. I don't mean swearing as in cursing. I mean swearing as in giving an oath, unless it's absolutely required, and it's never absolutely required in society today, because even if you are asked to testify in a court, or you have to sign an affidavit, something has to be notarized, you could always cross out the word swear and you write affirm, which means you're saying what I'm telling you is the truth. When you say swear, which is an English translation of the word shavua, it means you're invoking God, that God is my witness that what I say is true. You're schlepping, you know what schlepping means? You're schlepping God into your petty matters. That's how important your case is, that you're going to schlep God, that he's going to come to testify for you. So it's something to avoid. I know many Jews over the long history of the Jewish people would rather lose a fortune than to swear in court that about their case. Even though their case was 100% true, and they knew that it was true, they would say, I don't want to swear. I don't want to make God testify on my behalf. Okay, so what am I saying this for? Because when you were saying a blessing, you're invoking God's name, and you don't want to say the wrong blessing. So what happens if we say the wrong blessing? And by the way, the exception is you don't say the blessing unless you're actually eating. exception is when teaching blessings to a child or to someone who has very little knowledge. And if you don't say the word properly, they're not going to learn. When you hear someone saying a blessing, you answer Amen. Amen. What does that mean? Someone is praising someone. You're standing, let's say, with a friend, and your friend praises another person, and you're standing there and you don't say anything. It may be because you don't agree. So you're obligated to say, I agree. That's what amen means. I agree. I second the motion. But you don't say amen after your own blessing. Many people think saying amen is the right thing. So if you say a blessing and you conclude with amen, that was an interruption. Because it doesn't make sense to say, I think you're a great person, and I agree with that, with what I just said. You don't have to agree with what you just said it. If one is not sure whether he said the blessing or not, don't say it. Why? Because you may be saying God's name in vain. So if you don't remember, and unfortunately, when you get a little older, you can sometimes, what was I saying? Two things that happen, and you could forget if you said the blessing. Well, it's too late. You shouldn't take the chances of saying his name in vain. Another last thing on this list, and you can read the other things on your own. One is not permitted to talk after saying the blessing before eating the food. You say the blessing, you have to eat the food immediately, because otherwise it's not clear what the blessing was about. So you can't interrupt. And if you did interrupt, you have to say the blessing again, unless the interruption related to the food, to the meal. So people have to be careful after they say the blessing. Immediately after, you eat the food. You take the first bite, and you swallow it, and then you could talk. Okay, anyone has any questions? So I'm leaving this. Everyone should take this home with you, and this is homework to practice all the different blessings, and you'll see how it changes the meal if you think what you're saying. Not just saying it by rote, as some people will do. Once you get used to saying it, you don't even realize you're saying it. That's the challenge, to say it and think what you're saying and show how grateful we are to God for all the different things that God gives us in our lives. Yeah, she was first, yeah. Yes? No, you.
Just really quick, so you know, like at Thanksgiving, you see sometimes families go before they eat, they'll say it's mostly like Gentiles. So
Yeah, the question was, Thanksgiving, people hold hands when they say their blessing before eating. No, that's not a Jewish custom. Why do they do it? You have to ask them. I don't know. I don't know.
Why do you put salt on bread when?
The question was asked why we put salt on bread. Actually, we dip the bread in the salt. There are two essential reasons given. One, in the Torah, it says that you're supposed to, when you offer a sacrifice, you're supposed to put salt on it. Why? Because the sacrifice was there to cement a relationship with God, to create a covenant with God. What's the definition of a covenant? A relationship that endures. There are all sorts of relationships in this world. You have business relationships. They don't always last. They're not supposed to last forever. But when our relationship with God is a covenant means no matter what happens, we'll always be connected. Salt is a preservative. So salt symbolizes that this is here forever. It's never going to get spoiled. Salt does not get spoiled. That's the simple reason. Then there's a deeper reason that the bread symbolizes God's kindness. Salt, which is a pungent, caustic mineral, represents God's judgment, harshness. Salt is harsh. Bread is sustaining and nourishing. So when you dip the bread in the salt, you're tempering the judgment. You're telling God, thank you for the kindness that's represented by the bread, and thank you for withholding your judgment, your harsh judgment against us. So salt represents judgment, and bread represents God's kindness and benevolence. Also, it's also known that the numerical value of bread, lechem, and the numerical value of salt, ha-lechem, the bread, and ha-melech, the salt, is 78. They both are 78. And 78 is 3 times 26, which is God's name. The tetragrammaton, the yud and the hey and the vav and the hey, adds up to 26. So it represents 3 times God's name, which is a reinforcement of God's compassion. And when something you do 3 times creates a pattern, an established pattern. Yes?
I don't know if water is considered a food, but is
Water?
there a blessing for water?
Oh, okay, I'm glad you asked that. The question was, what about water? Okay, water is different in one way from any other beverage. If you drink water because you're thirsty, then you say the blessing shahakol, the generic blessing. But if you drink water, you have to take some pills, and you're not thirsty, and the water is just plain water, no sugar in it, nothing else in it, you don't make a blessing. Because it's not there it's there just an accessory to the pills.
So water is considered a food then?
Yes, it is. If you drink it because you're thirsty. So it satisfies a certain nutritional need to quench your thirst. Yes?
So basically, if you want to get away with saying one blessing, if you have bread at every meal, you're
Yeah.
covered.
Right. Now, I'll give you an example. Rice is from the Talmud onward, there's a big dispute about rice. You know, some societies live on rice. That's their staple. Not bread, but it's rice. So according to the different opinions about this and different customs, the Chabad custom is to try to eat rice in a meal with bread. That way you avoid the question. If you can't eat bread, for whatever reason, you're not hungry for bread and you don't have bread, you say the generic blessing for rice. Some people are more creative. Since there's 3 possibilities of rice, one could be mizonos, it's for grain, the blessing for grain. One could be hadama, something fruit of the earth. One could be the generic blessing. So people will eat 3 different foods, each with those blessings, and they'll cover the rice. But that means you have to eat other stuff that you may not want to eat. So if you can't eat bread and you can't eat those other 3 foods, you say shahakol, the generic blessing. That's the Chabad ruling.
And same thing with quinoa?
Quinoa, I'm not sure. There's a dispute about quinoa. Do you remember what they say about quinoa?
Google.
What?
Google.
Don't
Yeah.
eat it.
No, I can find out very easily.
Rabbi Google, I know.
I don't eat quinoa, so.
What did Marie Antoinette, what did she say? Yeah.
Oh, she famously said,
Let me take-
let him make mizonos. That's what she really said. You didn't know that she was a Talmudic scholar.
Latin, the Romans had in vino veritas, the same saying, in wine is truth. So, and also their word for wine is vino, and you're saying.
Same thing, yeah.
Are they all related?
Yes.
So we came first.
How do you say wine in Russian?
Vino.
Vino?
Vino. How do you say wine in Spanish?
Vino.
In French?
Vin. Yeah, and-
See, they're all languages got it from Hebrew.
Vin? So it's vin.
Blessing for quinoa. What is? Okay, I'm looking it up. Oh. Although it appears like a grain, quinoa is actually the seed of a plant related to spinach. Since it grows from flowering plant, the blessing is hadama. It's like a vegetable. It's not a grain. Okay, I think there are those who disagree. This is one side.
It's like peanut, it looks like a grain, but it's not.
Right.
Yeah, looks like a nut, but it's not.
But I say about this explanation, it can be mistake too.
A different opinion.
Yes.
Right, there are. What about hydroponics? Something that's grown hydroponically. Again, there are different opinions, but it seems that the consensus is that it's shahakol. It's not the normal blessing. It's the generic blessing, because you can't say Borei Pri Hadama, blessed is the creator of the earth, fruit of the earth. It's not fruit of the earth. It's not fruit of a tree. It comes from water. So you'd make shahakol.
But you don't necessarily know where.
You don't know. That's the problem. I mean, I think they do have to label it if it's
Yeah, sometimes they
hydroponics.
label tomatoes as hydroponic.
Talking about blessings on food, we have to be very careful not to buy Israeli produce. It sounds terrible, but unless it's under supervision, unless it says that this was tithed and it's not a product of the sabbatical year that was not processed the proper way. Because this year is the sabbatical year in Israel, and produce cannot be, and if you find produce from the sabbatical year, there are many laws about how you can't throw the produce out, you have to eat all of it. It gets complicated. So Israeli produce is a problem, unless it's under supervision, and there are products that you can get supervised. But if you go into the store and they have fruits, Israeli oranges or something like that, you have to find out whether that company did everything they had to do. When someone goes to Israel and they keep kosher, I remember people saying, I made sure that I only went to fruit store. I didn't go to any meat places that sold meat because I didn't know if it was kosher. But in Israel, your fruit stores have to be under rabbinic supervision. Fruits and vegetables. Israel has greater demands of us than we have here outside of Israel. Greater challenges in Israel to keep kosher.
Can they sell?
But it
Like-
depends how deep kosher have person.
Well, obviously, some people try to keep kosher, but they don't do it all the way. But if they want to do it the right way, then they have to make sure that their fruits are kosher as well. In a what? Yeah, it'll be problems next year as well.
So what are they doing in Israel?
Oh,
I mean, they have to eat something.
there are ways that allow you to get around the restrictions, but you have to make sure that the product is under rabbinic supervision, and they will determine whether it was done the right way.
We came with my friend, we came to kosher restaurant, cafe, and I want to order coffee. And he checked it. He told me, you can drink, I cannot drink in this cafe because water in this cafe not kosher enough for him.
I don't know what that means.
I don't know too, but he say this brand water not
In
kosher
Israel?
for him. Yeah.
That I never heard of, water being a problem. The only problem that can be in water is, there was a whole big question in New York City
Yeah,
that the water had certain bugs.
crustaceans.
Right. And there are different opinions about whether the water was kosher or not. And some rabbis required filtering all water in New York City area. We don't have that problem here, but in New York City they had that problem.
The microscopic.
Okay, that's the issue. That's one of the issues. Every time you take some water from a lake or anything, there might be microscopic insects, and insects are not kosher. But if you can't see them, they're kosher. Because God could not have told us to avoid things that we can't ever know that they exist, unless you have some microscope. So vegetables in America could also be a problem. Romaine lettuce, people like to eat romaine lettuce. Especially if they're organic, they're infested with bugs. When we serve romaine lettuce, every leaf of lettuce undergoes very careful examination. And sometimes there's just so many, especially if it's organic, that it doesn't even pay to look through it because it's going to be futile. There's definitely going to be bugs, visible bugs.
Even if you wash it?
Washing is not enough. You have to check every leaf carefully.
You have to wash each leaf separately.
You have to wash, that goes without saying, you have to wash each leaf.
You put it in the salad spinner, it gets rid of some of it.
That may be true. Some people have a light that they use, they put it under a light, so they can tell. It's not easy to do everything right. If I had a dime for every bug that everyone has eaten inadvertently, I'd be a rich person.
That with that gross statement.
But if people store like potatoes last, in a root cellar or whatever, they can still eat them because they weren't grown in the Jubilee year, right? They were grown beforehand.
Israeli produce, yeah, but they
Yeah.
have to be tithed also. Actually, the sabbatical year does not require tithing. It's the pre-sabbatical year that requires.
Right, but if they save them and, if people have root cellars or
Yeah.
whatever, they can still eat them.
Yeah. Okay, so everyone,
Next week is not,
next week?
is the fast.
Next week is the postponed fast of the 17th of Tammuz, which is the anniversary of the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem that led to the destruction of the temple 3 weeks later. We're hoping that Mashiach will be here and then it'll turn into a holiday, so we'll be celebrating with a lot of wine. But God forbid if Mashiach doesn't come, by then it's a fast day, so we won't be a class next week.
Do we have a 10 o'clock class also?
Well, we're going to start again the 2 classes. When do we start?
I don't know if we'll start 10 o'clock,
Okay,
probably
well,
after the 3 weeks.
well, to be announced.
The following week, we'll have a class, right?
Yeah, why not? We'll talk about the 3 weeks. Okay, the week after next week, we'll have a special class on the 3 weeks period. So that'll be 11 o'clock.
11 o'clock, so it's July 24th.
Just 11 o'clock.
Just 11, yeah. The 10 o'clock will probably start sometime in August. The 10 and 11, yeah.